They took everything but my silence. And now I'll make that the loudest thing they ever hear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elaine Whitlock, though you might only hear that name whispered at boardroom meetings or charity galas these days, always in the past tense. A woman they assume has stepped back after her husband's death, quietly fading into the embroidered wallpaper of the Whitlock estate. I let them believe that. For 2 years, I sat still. I wore the pearls. I smiled through the dinners. I let them edge me out of every room I once commanded. They thought I was grieving, and I was. But not for Henry. For what he left me with. For the wolves in my home dressed in family crests. They thought I was just an old woman, one breath away from irrelevance. What they never considered was that I never stopped counting. And now? Now it's time they learned what happens when a widow opens her ledger. It was a Tuesday when Henry died, fast and unceremonious. A sharp pain in his chest while opening the Morning Post. By the time the ambulance arrived, the toast was still warm. I stood there, shaking slightly, my mind already sorting logistics. He'd have hated that. By Friday, his children had taken over. We were married 39 years, Henry and I. I met him when he was just a brash young architect with more ambition than clients. He built towers. I built balance sheets. He was brilliant, impulsive. I was precise, unseen. That suited us both. But when he passed, the children he'd had before our marriage, Luke and Claudia, pounced like carrion. "Elaine," Luke had said at the wake, patting my hand like a nurse addressing a confused patient, "you shouldn't worry about anything. We'll take care of the business. You should focus on resting." They moved me into the garden suite of my own home within a week. My favorite armchair disappeared. The pantry was suddenly full of things I didn't eat. Claudia replaced the paintings in the East Corridor with minimalist prints that made the halls feel like a mausoleum. I played the part. The grieving widow. The fading matriarch. The unassuming guest in a house I'd once designed every detail of, from the slate tiles to the copper gutters. But I never stopped watching. And more importantly, I never stopped listening. It began with whispers. Luke taking private meetings in Henry's old study. Claudia fielding calls from reporters at odd hours, spinning narratives about modernizing the family brand. I was barely cold from the funeral when the staff began disappearing, starting with Elsie, the head cook of 20 years. She was stealing, Claudia had said smoothly, not even blinking. No, dear. That's what we call projection. One evening, I overheard them in the drawing room. They thought I was asleep. "She won't fight," Claudia said. "She's old." And honestly, she was never really a partner in the business. Luke laughed, low and amused. Dad never told her half of what went on toward the end. She doesn't even know about the Redmore deal. I knew about Redmore. I knew exactly how they'd sold part of the estate property into a shell company, then rented it back at double the cost to create artificial losses. I knew because Henry had come to me a month before he died, concerned. He thought something wasn't right. He was right. But he didn't have time to act. I did. Shaped that night, I walked into Henry's old study, still technically Luke's office now, and opened the second drawer of the mahogany desk. The false bottom was still there. He never changed the key. Beneath it, Henry's ledgers. And beneath those, mine. 7 books, bound in leather, numbered in gold. Each one filled with handwriting so exact, so precise it could make an auditor weep. You see, Henry built the empire. But I built the books. And it was time I balanced them. The garden suite had once been the music room. Years ago, before the renovations, it had been filled with light and the echo of Henry's late-night piano. Now it was a sterile retreat. A place where they could tuck me away and still point at the bay window and say, "She's comfortable, she has her space." Like I was a prize cat in a sunbeam. They had replaced my writing desk with a designer console table, more for aesthetics than use. My books had been boxed and replaced with a curated selection of titles. I had no interest in reading books with blank covers and statement fonts, the kind that scream sophistication to people who never finish the first chapter. The wardrobe they installed didn't even have drawers for my scarves. "Minimalism is in," Claudia said sweetly when I raised an eyebrow. "You'll feel so free." I nodded and made a note. Claudia believes stripping a woman's space gives her freedom. Claudia is wrong. The staff that remained were young, interchangeable, quiet. I noticed the housekeepers never stayed more than a month. I began to engage them gently, politely. Little questions. Tiny facts. "I heard Mr. Luke is away again this weekend," I'd say, sipping weak tea. "Yes, ma'am. A property tour in Lisbon." Interesting. The Lisbon deal had been wrapped the previous quarter. I knew that because I still had access to Henry's old email server. He never changed passwords. I logged in weekly. Then there were the disappearing portraits. Paintings of Henry's ancestors, stately and serious, oil-brushed into legacy, vanished from the West Hall. One day there, next day, gone. Sold. Liquidated, no doubt. By the time I confirmed it, through a private auction database, I still had a contact and they were already in Geneva. Anonymous buyer. Luke had no idea I knew that name, or that I once co-signed the buyer's first development loan. The irony tasted like good sherry. But the most telling change of all came quietly. They removed the brass plaque by the study door. H.G. Whitlock, founder. No announcement. No explanation. Just gone. They didn't just want to rewrite the estate, they wanted to erase the man who built it. And by extension, the woman who held the scaffolding. But I was still here. And I had not forgotten the scaffolding. I began to restore what I could in secret. A slip of wallpaper removed here, a framed letter from Henry placed back above the fireplace when no one was watching. I reconnected with old contacts, carefully, discreetly. Dorothy, the firm's former financial controller, met me under the guise of tea. She brought a sealed envelope. Inside, it contained printouts from recent financials. Records Claudia had claimed were proprietary. What they showed: payments to shell firms, accounts rerouted offshore, and something called Vermont Junction Holdings, a name not seen in our records since the 1980s. Why resurrect a dormant subsidiary? Because they thought no one was left who remembered. But I did. One night, around midnight, I walked quietly to the main hallway. I knew the cameras were on. I knew I was being watched. So I said aloud, "For the record, I miss Henry. He'd be ashamed of what this house has become." I let the words linger. Then I walked past the den, Luke's new strategic planning lounge, and slipped a tiny flash drive into the desk drawer where he used to keep his cigars. Let them think I was unraveling. Let them underestimate me. It was all part of the plan. When you've spent 40 years watching numbers lie for men who thought they were telling the truth, you begin to notice patterns, how arrogance always miscalculates, how greed always assumes silence equals consent. They believed I had stopped watching. But I hadn't. Because I had ledger number 7. I began ledger number 1 when Henry and I merged our lives and our finances. While he expanded Whitlock and Wren, I kept quiet tabs on the cracks forming in the foundation, land deals made with handshake promises, Cousin Harold's brief rebranding of family trust funds into a doomed startup, tax loopholes no one wanted to explain too carefully. Ledger number 7 was different. It was mine. Hidden beneath a floorboard in the old greenhouse tool shed, a place no one thought twice about since the roof collapsed after the hurricane 2 years ago. I had wrapped it in wax cloth and tucked it inside a rusted metal tin that once held lemon drops. In it, I documented everything since Henry's death. Dates, contracts, conversations, payments, patterns. It wasn't just paranoia. It was preservation. On July 14th, 3 weeks after Henry's funeral, I noted the first entry. Luke met with Russell Greer from Montrose Equity. He told me it was a condolence lunch. But Russell hasn't owned a tie since 2010, and he showed up in a three-piece suit. Conclusion: pitch meeting. That deal would later turn into the Redmore Shell acquisition, now tied to a questionable transfer of estate property that should have required trustee approval, mine. They thought I wouldn't notice the valuation discrepancy. They didn't know I still had an old friend at the county assessor's office. Entry from September 3rd. Claudia ordered the second audit of the Whitlock Foundation. Quietly eliminated 3 outreach programs and routed funds into digital brand development. Result: $80,000 vanished into a firm called Emberstream LLC. Emberstream didn't exist in any registry. But I remembered the name. It was Claudia's failed fashion startup. The one she launched before marrying Henry's son. She'd resurrected it and was laundering charity funds through it. I had proof now. I just wasn't ready to use it. Not yet. The final entry I made that week was less about numbers and more about instinct. The walls have ears. There's something in the suite. Not just cameras, something else. Possibly audio. Began rehearsing a script. Loneliness, confusion, mentions of altered documents. Let them overhear what they want to hear. I played the long game. On purpose. I began to say things while arranging flowers or folding linens. Things like, I think I misplaced the deed again. Maybe Henry left it somewhere strange. Or, what a shame if someone were to revisit the insurance papers. All those clauses. I wanted to see what they'd do. The bait worked. A week later, I returned from a walk to find my drawers slightly rearranged. Nothing taken. Just off. Luke was hunting, and I was letting him. That evening, I retrieved ledger number 7, placed it into a fireproof lockbox, and made a copy. 1 physical, 1 digital. The physical copy I sent to Dorothy with instructions to hold it for safekeeping. The digital version? I encrypted it under a fake Pinterest profile labeled Widow Garden Ideas. Let them trace that. Because here's what no one teaches these power-hungry heirs. A paper trail cuts both ways. And when it leads back to the person you tried to erase, it becomes a fuse. And ledger number 7 was my match. It began with the mailroom boy. His name was Leo. 18, fresh out of trade school, all nervous smiles and impeccable manners. He was the kind of young man Henry would have mentored, the kind who still called you ma'am even after you told him not to. Then one day, he vanished. I asked the house manager where Leo had gone. Transferred, she said. Corporate restructuring. That was their favorite phrase lately. By the end of the month, 4 more longtime staff members had been restructured. Gloria, who'd been with the family for 22 years and whose only crime was refusing to use Claudia's preferred linen vendor. Jerome, our groundskeeper, who once saved Henry's rose garden from a fungal blight with nothing but garlic and whiskey. Gone. The culling was surgical. They weren't just trimming the fat. They were scraping away the memory. And me? I was next. Luke's memo to the board arrived 2 days later. It was dressed up in the usual corporate language, talk of streamlining, maximizing, digitizing. Buried in the jargon was the truth. We believe it's time to restructure the estate's top oversight role into an honorary advisory position for Mrs. Elaine Whitlock. Honorary. They were planning to strip me of my final veto power and rebrand it as a compliment. I didn't reply. Instead, I baked a pie. And while it cooled on the windowsill like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting, I opened my laptop and scheduled 3 meetings, one with Dorothy, one with the estate's former attorney, and one with the land registrar's office. Because if they wanted to play chess, I would show them I was the board. The registrar's office confirmed my suspicion. The east wing of the estate, the guest cottages, old stables, and part of the wooded backlit had been quietly rezoned, sold to an entity called Vermont Junction Holdings, LLC. The purchase? Finalized just 2 months after Henry's funeral. The signature authorizing the sale? A scanned copy of Henry's name. Poorly forged. They didn't even try. But what chilled me wasn't the forgery. It was what the sale meant. You see, that land wasn't just valuable. It was entitled land, meant for preservation. According to Henry's original estate documents, it could not be sold without the co-signature of a living trustee. And that trustee was me. Back at the house, I played dumb. I wore a soft cardigan and asked Claudia if we could have a little talk. We sat in the conservatory, surrounded by monstera plants she couldn't keep alive, but insisted on decorating with anyway. I've noticed so many changes, I said gently. It's hard to keep up. Henry always said you were so good with details. She smiled, teeth like piano keys. Well, we want to make things efficient. Less clutter. More forward-thinking. Of course, I said, though I was confused by the land sale. She blinked. The what? The sale of the East Wing. To Vermont Junction Holdings. Her posture stiffened, but she recovered quickly. Oh, that. Very minor. Strategic pivot. Of course, I said again. It just surprised me, since Henry and I agreed that section would be preserved. Claudia's smile thinned. That was before. Things change, Elaine. I leaned in, soft and deliberate. So do people, dear. That night, I logged into the private backup server Henry had once used to store insurance documentation. It wasn't protected by modern encryption, just a simple two-word password. March Garden inside were the scanned originals of every land entitlement agreement. And at the top of the list, the original preservation clause. Ironclad. Co-signature required. And the last signer? Me. Not Henry. Me. They'd forged the wrong name. By morning, I had filed an injunction with the registrar's office to freeze all transactions related to the land until ownership could be reviewed. I didn't tell Claudia or Luke. I let the courier deliver it to their morning meeting. And as I watched Luke storm across the lawn, red-faced and phone in hand, I sat back in my little garden suite and sipped my tea. You called the wrong widow, darling. The envelope was cream-colored, hand-addressed in violet ink, and sealed with a wax stamp I hadn't seen in years, an embossed forget-me-not. Dorothy's old signature flourish. It arrived on a Thursday, tucked between estate catalogs and a mailed invitation to the annual Whitlock Foundation Gala, an event they still sent me invites to but no longer expected me to attend. I slit the envelope open with my silver letter knife, the one Henry gave me on our 3rd anniversary, and pulled out a single, folded sheet. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, elegant, curved, but no longer delicate. It had the weight of someone who'd seen too much and waited too long to say it. Elaine, I've debated whether to send this for weeks, but I'm out of time. They came to me. Claudia first, then Luke. Wanted access to old financial archives from before the restructuring. Claimed it was forensics. It wasn't. They're gutting Whitlock and Wren from the inside. Selling parts of it to offshore investors using dormant corporations. One of them, Bluebridge Capital, links back to your stepson's Travel LLC. I did some digging. It's all under aliases. The kind you don't create unless you're laundering something. I'm scared, Elaine. But I know you're not. Watch Vermont Junction. Follow the numbers. Enclosed is a list of properties and a flash drive with the records I managed to recover before I resigned. Password's the same one we used in Geneva. I trust you remember. They think you're out of the game. Prove them wrong. D. I stared at the final line for a long moment. They think you're out of the game. No, darling. I was just waiting for you to pass the ball. The flash drive was taped to the back of the letter. I peeled it off carefully and brought it to the old laptop I kept hidden inside the linen closet behind a false panel. Not part of the house's Wi-Fi. No spyware. No access. Just pure, untouchable data. The Geneva password was easy to remember. March Garden 1975, the year we took that trip. The year Henry proposed. The screen loaded slowly, and then the files opened. There were over 40 documents, PDFs of internal financial memos, unregistered leases, records of funds withdrawn from dormant accounts and funneled into numbered companies across the Caymans and Isle of Man. I opened one folder titled SJH Holdings. Inside was a document with Luke's digital signature. It was a land transfer agreement. The recipient? SJH Holdings. The sender? Vermont Junction LLC. The land? The Whitlock family burial grounds. I stood up, suddenly breathless. That section of the estate was never to be touched. It was in every version of the will, every contract, every public statement Henry ever made. Generations of Whitlocks rested there. It was sacred. They weren't just greedy. They were desecrating the dead. I copied the entire drive. One version for Dorothy's lawyer, one for the Department of Public Land Use, and one for a trusted investigative reporter Henry once mentored who still owed me a favor. But I kept one version for myself. Because the most dangerous thing you can give a woman like me is a motive. And now? I had one. That night, I sat in the garden, the air thick with lavender and the rustle of late summer leaves. I didn't cry. I calculated. I planned. Because you don't put your foot on a queen's throat and expect her not to rise. And as I looked up at the old manor house glowing in the dark, my home, my name, my legacy, I whispered, "You wanted a ghost in the attic? You got one." The first time I caught the red light blinking in the corner of my mirror, I thought it was a trick of the eye. Morning sun, maybe? A reflection. Then I saw it again 2 days later, after twilight. Faint. Calculated. The cameras weren't just in the hallways. They were in my suite. It wasn't entirely surprising. Luke had always preferred the security of control to the vulnerability of trust. And Claudia, well, her idea of privacy was something that applied to her, not others. But what interested me most wasn't the camera itself. It was what I could do with it. I began performing for them. At night, I'd sit at my vanity, murmuring to myself just loudly enough for the hidden microphone to pick up. So silly of me. I can't remember if I left the deed in the garden shed or the rose box. What was that number Henry used? Oh, something ending in 3-7-5. What a shame if someone found it. I really must stop talking to myself before I say something damning. I gave them breadcrumbs, carefully selected, deliberately false. Luke's next move confirmed it had worked. I returned from tea with Nadine to find my rose box disturbed. The ribbon was tied in the wrong direction. A classic amateur mistake. That night, I left a small note inside the false drawer of my writing desk. Keep looking. The truth isn't where you buried it. I imagined his face when he found it. But my favorite performance took place the evening I left the ledger in plain sight. Not the real one, of course. A facsimile. I spent 2 full nights crafting it, duplicating the handwriting, copying old entries from innocuous ledgers, and inserting enough partial truths to seem credible. It was a beautiful piece of fiction, just flawed enough to trap him. I placed it gently beneath the floorboard of the closet, then left the door ajar just slightly. 2 days later, the ledger was gone. The following week, Luke attempted to use it. At the board meeting, with a straight face, he presented the copy as a record of unauthorized financial activity, suggesting that I had tampered with the company's capital structure after Henry's death. It was laughable. The board, particularly Director Hargrave, a notoriously detail-obsessed man with no patience for flair, immediately noticed the inconsistent dates and mismatched fiscal years. Why would Mrs. Whitlock record a transaction in 2019 that didn't occur until 2021? Hargrave asked pointedly. Luke floundered. Then Director Lynn, whom I had quietly supported for re-election years ago, chimed in. Odd that the handwriting changes mid-entry. Almost as if it were rehearsed. Luke turned white. The fake ledger backfired. And the board requested a formal audit, this time with me invited to the Oversight Committee. I accepted. Graciously, of course. That night, I stood in the grand foyer, the one Claudia had recently gutted to modernize with chrome and glass. I wore my late mother's brooch and sipped sherry from the last unbroken crystal glass. The cameras were still rolling, so I faced them directly. And I smiled. Mistress of the house, I whispered. Not a guest. Not a memory. Still here. Let them watch. Let them tremble. Because soon, they'd realize something important. The walls they built to trap me were closing in on them instead. The Whitlock Trust was an old, dusty thing. Drafted when telegrams were still in use and signed with fountain pens on parchment, it had been amended and overwritten over the years by layers of attorneys trying to modernize a structure that was never designed to be clean. But Henry never fully modernized it. That was his sentimentality or his superstition. He believed the trust was cursed the moment it got too efficient. Turns out that curse was a blessing in disguise. Because inside those messy original papers was a clause Henry never revoked. A clause he quietly added after a disagreement with Luke 5 years before he died. A clause that gave me leverage. It was buried halfway through a 1993 revision document, written in archaic legalese. But the meaning was clear as day. In the event that provable financial misconduct is identified among direct heirs, interim fiduciary control of all trust-bound assets may be transferred to the surviving spouse for an indefinite term, pending full audit and review. In simpler terms, if I proved fraud, I got everything. Not just temporary board seats or symbolic titles. Full control of the estate, the business, the legacy. And based on the files from Dorothy and my own careful documentation, I had more than enough to make the case. But there was one problem. To enact the clause, I'd need a public hearing. A legal motion filed under the Whitlock Foundation's charter, requiring third-party arbitration. It would be slow, humiliating, and very, very public. That meant risk. But it also meant spectacle. And the one thing vultures like Luke and Claudia couldn't survive was having the rot of their empire exposed to sunlight. I started the process discreetly. I contacted Marla Grant, a retired estate lawyer who once represented Henry in a property dispute and who happened to owe me a favor from the 1980s when I had quietly covered her husband's gambling debts to keep her name off a scandal. She remembered. "Elaine," she said, her voice sharp as ever, "you understand that if we invoke this clause, they'll try to burn you at the stake." I didn't hesitate. Let them strike the match. The paperwork was filed under my name the following Monday morning. By noon, the press had picked it up. Widow challenges heirs for control of historic Whitlock estate fraud allegations linked to foreign shell companies. Burial ground transfer by 3 p.m. Claudia's car was in the driveway. She didn't knock. She walked straight into the garden suite, all composed rage and clicking heels. "You had no right," she hissed. "No right to air this in public." I looked up from my tea. I had every right. What I didn't have, I said slowly, was your permission. Fortunately, I'm not required to seek it. Claudia's lips curled. "You'll regret this." "No, dear. You will. Because while you were busy designing kitchen backsplashes for the modern elite, I was preserving evidence. You brought knives. I brought the blueprint of the battlefield." Her silence was glorious. She left without another word. That night, Nadine called me from her flat in Brighton. "I heard the news. Elaine, you didn't just step back into the arena, you bought it, burned the seats, and locked the doors behind you." I laughed harder than I had in years. Because she was right. This wasn't just about protecting what was mine anymore. It was about showing them that I had always been the rightful heir. And they had been playing with borrowed power all along. She arrived late on a Friday afternoon, carrying a single overnight bag and a look of reluctant hope. Alice. My granddaughter. Luke's daughter, though it pained me to say it aloud. 18 years old, fresh-faced and uncertain. I hadn't seen her properly in nearly a year. Claudia said she was studying abroad. A curious phrase, since no one could tell me which country she was supposedly in. Now here she stood thin, pale, and quiet. She hugged me without a word, holding on longer than expected. Her shoulders trembled slightly. It told me more than any sentence ever could. "I needed to see you," she said finally. I nodded. I know. Alice had always been different. She wasn't like her father, nor her mother. While Luke was obsessed with optics and Claudia with control, Alice watched from the margins. Quiet, observant, curious in ways that made her mother nervous. She would disappear into the library as a child, reading old letters and ledgers instead of fairy tales. She asked questions no one wanted to answer. At 14, she once asked me, "Why does everyone act like you're fragile when you're the only one who actually knows what's going on?" Smart girl. Too smart for that house. Over dinner, just the two of us, she told me everything. About how she'd overheard Luke screaming on the phone with an attorney over the missing Cayman access code. How Claudia had forbidden her from taking a scholarship to a university abroad because it would draw too much attention. How she discovered a safe in her father's home office behind the bookshelf and had watched Claudia open it once using a fingerprint reader. "They treat me like I'm made of glass," she said. "But I've seen more than they think. And I don't want to be like them." I reached across the table and took her hand. "You already aren't." That night, I showed her ledger number 7. She ran her fingers over the gold numbering, the worn leather edges. "You wrote all this?" Every word. She read in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Then, without prompting, she pulled a notebook from her bag, stuffed with notes, drawings, passwords, names. She had been keeping her own records, just like her grandmother. In the days that followed, Alice became my quiet apprentice. I taught her how to trace corporate structures, how to follow money through dummy accounts, how to cross-reference statements against hidden transfers. She learned quickly. We found dozens of discrepancies. More importantly, she found the key. A document Claudia had deleted from the digital archives but forgotten to remove from the printer log. It confirmed that Emberstream LLC, the fashion brand Claudia claimed had failed years ago, was still active, receiving large monthly transfers from the family foundation. Alice smiled as she showed it to me. She's been stealing charity money to fund her influencer brand. I closed my eyes and nodded. This is the thread. Now we pull it. On Sunday morning, Alice asked if she could visit the old orchard behind the chapel. "That's where Grandpa buried the first Whitlock deed, right?" she said. I stared at her, stunned. "How do you know that?" She shrugged. "You told me. When I was 10. You said it was our secret." I had, and I'd forgotten. We walked together through the orchard, side by side. When we reached the old pear tree, she stopped and turned to me. "You're not alone in this, Grandma." And for the first time in years, I truly believed it. The ballroom smelled like old perfume and polished ambition. The annual Chamberlain Estate auction was an invitation-only affair where heiresses, hedge funders, and discreet criminals all rubbed shoulders and traded generational artifacts as if they were poker chips. I hadn't attended in years, but this time I wasn't going as a Whitlock. I was going as a buyer. Alice had arranged everything, her first test in the field. She registered us under the name Margaret Ashcroft, an alias once used by Henry during a 1991 merger to quietly purchase back stock options that Luke had tried to flip. It was poetic. We sat quietly toward the back, disguised under wide-brimmed hats and sunglasses, like characters in a spy film. The catalog arrived. Page 14, lot number 207, Portrait Collection, Unknown American Lineage. For oil paintings, late 19th to early 20th century. Initials W noted on one frame. My breath caught. The Whitlock Ancestral Portraits. Sold off by Luke and Claudia 6 months after Henry's death. "Are you sure they're real?" Alice asked, her voice low. "They're real," I whispered. "And they don't belong to the highest bidder. They belong to our name." The auctioneer barely hesitated. The opening bid was $10,000. A man in a navy suit raised his paddle. 10. Another bidder, a woman in a diamond-encrusted shrug, followed. 12. I raised mine. 15. More bids came. Rapid fire. 19, 20, 25. I stayed quiet until it reached 38. Then I raised my hand once more. 45, I said. A hush fell over the room. The woman in diamonds paused, tilted her head, assessed me, then slowly set her paddle down. Sold. Lot number 2072. Ms. Ashcroft. When we returned to the car, Alice clutched the receipt with trembling fingers. You just bought our family history back. I nodded, staring out the window as we pulled away. No, I bought back proof. Because I knew what the others didn't. Inside one of the portrait frames was a small tin hidden by Henry himself, years ago during the estate's first attempted appraisal. He had once told me, if they ever try to tear down our name, you'll find the seed of it still behind a Whitlock's eyes. That night, with the portraits laid gently across my garden suite floor, I found the tin. Inside, a velvet pouch. And within it, the original trust memorandum. Not a copy, not notarized. The first draft, signed in ink that had faded with time, but not with intent. The clause? Still intact, but with one handwritten addition from Henry, in the event that no heir acts in the interest of the family's soul, the soul must rise to defend itself. And then, in his unmistakable scrawl, Elaine, if you're reading this, you know what to do. I don't want the house back, I told Alice later. I want the name back. She nodded solemnly. We will. Because now I didn't just have the numbers. I had the narrative. And once a story is back in the hands of its author, there's no telling how it ends. The fireproof box sat at the back of my closet behind a row of beige trench coats and scarves I hadn't worn since Henry's second retirement party. It was the same box that once held our marriage license, Alice's birth certificate, and a small vial of dirt from Henry's first construction site, his good luck charm. Now it held something far more dangerous. The real ledger. Ledger number 7, in its original form. Every entry, every irregular transaction, every forged document traced to Luke, Claudia, and their partners in this quiet massacre of our legacy. And it was time to use it. But not in court. Not yet. No, court would come later. First, I needed to break the illusion. The illusion that I was bluffing. That I'd blink first. That I was too old or too tired or too quiet to fight back. That's why I left the box out, deliberately unlocked, on the morning of the quarterly board meeting. It wasn't bait. It was an invitation. I forgot the fireproof box in the back seat of my car, parked in front of the estate. Then I took a long walk along the southern trail. When I returned, the box was gone. I didn't panic. I smiled, because the copy inside was rigged. It was a masterful blend of truth and fabrication, more dangerous than fiction, because it walked just close enough to the real crimes without confirming them. If Luke or Claudia used it publicly, they'd implicate themselves in their own lies. And I knew exactly where they'd try it. Today's board meeting. The boardroom was fuller than usual. The trust clause filing had caused a stir, and several passive shareholders had flown in just to see the fallout. Luke looked smug, barely concealing his triumph. Claudia sat beside him, composed, lips tight. I arrived last. Perfect timing. Before we begin, Luke said, rising, I'd like to address some misinformation that's been spreading. He placed the copied ledger on the table. I kept my face perfectly still. He flipped through pages as if he'd found the Holy Grail. This document, he said, details how Elaine manipulated financial data after my father's death, unauthorized transfers, false charitable distributions, actions designed to undermine the heirs and secure her own interests. I waited. Director Lynn leaned forward. Where did you get this? Luke hesitated. Anonymous source. Lynn raised a brow. That's not an answer. Hargrave, the one who'd questioned his earlier claims, picked up the ledger and examined it. Something's wrong, he said. The dates don't align with the audit schedule. This entry references a fund that didn't exist until last year. Murmurs spread. Claudia's hands curled in her lap. Hargrave flipped more pages. And here, this line suggests Elaine made a withdrawal on a day she was recorded at a hospital fundraiser. There's photographic proof. Luke tried to respond. Fumbled. Stammered. Enough, Lynn said flatly. You've wasted this board's time again with baseless claims. You've attempted to weaponize fabricated documents against the surviving trustee. Then he turned to me. Mrs. Whitlock, do you have a statement? I reached into my briefcase and placed a sealed envelope on the table. Within this envelope is the notarized, original version of Ledger Number 7. If the board wishes to see it, I will submit it under formal request. But I'd prefer to present it publicly at the hearing I requested last week. There was silence. Then a single voice, let her speak. And then, many, yes, let her speak. Back at home, I poured a small glass of scotch. Not wine, not tea. Scotch. The way Henry drank it when he knew a victory was only halfway through. Alice sat beside me, watching the fire crackle. You set him up, she said. No, I replied softly. He set himself up the day he believed he could steal the crown from a woman who built the throne. I clinked my glass softly. To the fireproof box. To the real ledger. To the storm that was now, finally, mine to release. The hearing was held in the old Whitlock Foundation Hall, a space Henry once used to host fundraising dinners, now transformed into a neutral venue for arbitration under the Trust's charter. Marble floors, high ceilings, and echoes sharp enough to slice through silence. Claudia arrived with her usual entourage, lawyers, PR advisors, and a personal assistant holding 3 phones. Luke came alone. His face was thinner now, his movements tighter. The kind of twitchy stillness that only happens when a man realizes he's running out of exits. I came with Alice. Not out of drama. Out of intention. Let them see who stood beside me. Let them see that I wasn't just defending the past. I was shaping the future. The trustee committee consisted of 3 neutral arbitrators and 2 appointed family representatives. I opened the envelope and passed them the real ledger No. 7 bound in leather, heavy in every sense of the word. I didn't need dramatics. The facts spoke for themselves. Wire transfers, illegally rerouted foundation funds, fake shell companies, signed approvals forged using Henry's old signature block, and payments quiet and frequent to Emberstream LLC, disguised as consulting services. At one point, Claudia interrupted. This is nonsense. These entries are fabricated. None of these records are in the main company files. I turned to her calmly. Exactly, because you deleted them. Gasps murmured through the hall. Alice stepped forward and handed the arbitrators a copy of the deleted printer log, the one she'd retrieved weeks earlier. It showed Claudia's laptop printing out 6 Emberstream financial statements, time-stamped, dated. They matched the entries in my ledger. The arbitrators examined them closely. One of them looked up at Claudia. Did you access these files? She hesitated, then lied. No. Alice handed over a photo from the surveillance archive, Claudia standing in her office with the printer tray open, reviewing the very same pages. Not a smoking gun, a flaming cannonball. But it wasn't over yet, because the final document, presented by my counsel, was one Henry had signed a year before he died. A private addendum to the trust. It included a handwritten clause, should any heir, direct or extended, seek to undermine the foundational ethics of Whitlock and Wren, control of all trust-tied assets shall revert to Elaine Whitlock, as my wife, partner, and sole protector of legacy. Luke stood then, desperate. This is manipulation. She poisoned him against us. Sit down, one of the arbitrators snapped. He sat, and with that, the ruling was issued. Elaine Whitlock, full authority as interim fiduciary controller of the trust, business, and estate, effective immediately. Luke and Claudia, formally removed from all executive roles pending civil investigation and potential criminal inquiry. The room erupted. Reporters swarmed outside. Phones buzzed with alerts. Alice took my hand and squeezed it once. Hard. That night, I walked the hallways of my home, the real ones, not the corridors I had been exiled to. The portraits were back on the walls. The warmth returned to the lights. My footsteps echoed in peace. I stood before Henry's study, placed my hand on the doorframe, and whispered, "It's done." Then I turned to Alice. "Tomorrow, we start the audit. Every penny, every policy, Every name. It all gets cleaned. She nodded. Yes, ma'am. Because Whitlock wasn't just a name anymore. It was a fire, and I was its keeper. Spring came early that year. The daffodils along the stone path bloomed brighter than I remembered, as if the earth itself sensed the weight that had lifted. The estate was quiet again, not in exile, but in balance. Not silenced, but settled. I walked the orchard with Alice that morning, baskets in hand, collecting the first pears of the season. The same ones Henry once insisted were too delicate for market, but just right for a family pie. The soil was familiar underfoot. Rich, rooted, just like us. The headlines had softened. Claudia vanished to a wellness retreat in Switzerland after the court froze her assets. Luke hired a new lawyer, one known for managing public disgrace with silence and settlements. The Whitlock Foundation was under new governance, its funds restored and now publicly audited quarterly under Alice's watchful eye. And me? I was no longer the widow in the garden suite. I was Chairwoman Whitlock again. We rebuilt slowly. The ancestral art came home. The East Wing, nearly lost to Luke's greed, was restored and converted into a non-profit architecture institute, offering free design mentorship to local students. The burial grounds were sealed under historic preservation, and for the first time in decades, the townspeople were invited back into the estate for a spring garden festival. The same community Henry and I once built for now walking its halls freely again. One man approached me, older, with kind eyes and calloused hands. I used to deliver lumber here when Henry was still laying bricks, he said. Thought it was gone for good, but it feels like it's Whitlock again. It always was, I said gently. Some people just needed reminding. That afternoon, Alice joined me in the newly restored sunroom. She placed a small leather-bound notebook on the table, her own ledger. She had started one. I smiled. Good, I said. Never let them write the record for you. She tilted her head. Will they come back? Maybe, I said. Greed always circles. But this time, they won't find a quiet widow waiting. She grinned. You're not so quiet anymore. I reached for her hand and gave it a proud squeeze. No, I said, but I'm still patient. Later, I returned to the garden. The pear blossoms swayed softly in the breeze. I knelt near the roots and buried something small, wrapped in linen and tied with a blue ribbon. Ledger no, its job was finished. Some stories, once told, don't need to be retold. They just need to be buried deep, where they can nourish what grows next. I stood slowly, brushing the dirt from my hands. And as I looked out at the estate, I whispered not to the ghosts, but to the future. You took my silence for surrender. But I was never gone. I was just waiting. To be loud,